8 Reasons Why Rome Fell. It's an article I found on web by Evan Andrews. It was written originally on January 14th, 2014. Number one reason: invasions by barbarian tribes. The most straightforward theory for Western Rome's collapse pins the fall on a string of military losses sustained against outside forces. Rome had tangled with Germanic tribes for centuries, but by the 300s, barbarian groups like the Goths had encroached beyond the empire borders. The Romans weathered a Germanic uprising in the late 4th century, but in 410 the king Alaric successfully sacked the city of Rome. The empire spent the next several decades under constant threats before the Eternal City was raided again in 455, this time by the Vandals. Finally, in 476, the Germanic leader Odoacer staged a revolt and deposed the emperor Romulus Augustulus. From then on, no Roman Empire would ever again rule from a post in Italy, leading many to cite 476 as the year the Western Empire suffered its death blow. Number two reason for the Roman fall was economic troubles and over-reliance on slave labor. Even as Rome was under attack from outside forces, it was also crumbling from within thanks to severe financial crisis. Constant wars and overspending had significantly lightened imperial coffers, and oppressive taxation and inflation had widened the gap between rich and poor. In the hope of avoiding the taxman, many members of the wealthy classes had even fled to the countryside and set up independent fiefdoms. At the same time, the empire was rocked by a labor deficit. Rome's economy depended on slaves to till its fields and work as craftsmen, and its military might had traditionally provided a fresh influx of conquered people to put to work. But when expansion ground to halt in the 2nd century, Rome's supply of slaves and the war treasures began to dry up. Third, the rise of the Eastern Empire. The fate of Western Rome was partially sealed in the late 3rd century when the Emperor Diocletian divided the empire into two halves: the Western Empire seated in the city of Milan and the Eastern Empire in Byzantium, later known as Constantinople. The division made the empire more easily governable in the short term, but over time the two halves drifted apart. East and West failed to adequately work together to combat outside threats, and the two often squabbled over resources and military aid. Emperors like Constantine ensured that the city of Constantinople was fortified and well guarded, but Italy and the city of Rome, which only had symbolic value for many in the East, were left vulnerable. The Western political structure would finally disintegrate in the 5th century, but the Eastern Empire endured in some form for another 1,000 years before being overwhelmed by the Ottoman Empire in the 1400s. 4. Overexpansion and military overspending. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Euphrates River in the Middle East. but its grandeur may have also been its downfall. With such a vast territory to govern, the empire faced an administrative and logistical nightmare. Even with their excellent road systems, the Romans were unable to communicate quickly or effectively enough to manage their holdings. Rome struggled to marshal enough troops and resources to defend its frontier from local rebellions and outside attacks, and by the 2nd century, the Emperor Hadrian was forced to build his famous fall in Britain just to keep the enemy at bay. As more and more funds were funneled into the military upkeeps of the empire, technological advancement slowed and Rome's civil infrastructure fell into despair. Fifth, government corruption and political instability. If Rome's sheer size made it difficult to govern, ineffective and inconsistent leadership only served to magnify the problem. Being the Roman emperor had always been a particularly dangerous job, but during the 2nd and 3rd century, it nearly became a death sentence. Civil war thrust the empire into chaos, and more than 20 men took the throne in the span of only 75 years, usually after the murder of their predecessor. Number 6. The arrival of the Huns and the migration of the barbarian tribes. The barbarian attacks on Rome partially stemmed from a mass migration caused by the Huns' invasion of Europe in the late 4th century. When these warriors rampaged through northern Europe, they drove many Germanic tribes to the border of the Roman Empire. The Romans allowed members of the Visigoth tribe to cross south of Danube and into the safety of Roman territory, but they treated them with extreme cruelty. According to the historian, Roman officials even forced the starving Goths to trade their children into slavery in exchange for dog meat. When the operation became too much to bear, the Goths rose up in revolt and eventually routed a Roman army and killed the Eastern Emperor during the battle in 378 AD. The shocked Romans negotiated a flimsy peace with the barbarians, but the truce unraveled in 410 when the Goth king Alaric moved west and sacked Rome. With the Western Empire weakened, Germanic tribes like the Vandals and the Saxons were able to surge across its border and occupy Britain, Spain, and North Africa. Number 7. Christianity and the loss of traditional values. The decline of Rome with the spread of Christianity, and some have argued that the rise of a new faith helped contribute to the empire's fall. The Edict of the Milan legalized Christianity in 313 and it later became the state religion in 380. These ended centuries of persecution, but they may have also eroded the traditional Roman value system. Christianity displaced the polytheistic Roman religion, which viewed the emperor as having a divine status, and also shifted focus away from the glory of the state and onto a sole deity. Meanwhile, popes and other church leaders took an increased role in political affairs, further complicating governance. The 18th century historian Edward Gibbon was the most famous proponent of this theory, but his take has since been widely criticized. With the spread of Christianity may have played a small role in curbing Roman civic virtue, most scholars now argue that its influence paled in comparison to military, economic, and administrative factors. Number 8. Weakening of the Roman legions. For most of its history, Rome's military was the envy of the ancient world, but during the decline, the makeup of the once mighty legions began to change. Unable to recruit enough soldiers from the Roman citizenry, emperors like Constantine began hiring foreign mercenaries to prop up their armies. The rank of the legions eventually swelled with Germanic, Goths, and other barbarians, so much so that Romans began using the Latin word barbarus in place of soldier. While these Germanic soldiers of fortune proved to be fierce warriors, they also had little or no loyalty to the empire, and the power hungry officers often turned against their Roman employers.